Chapter 5, which is about the underground river and rescue by a Hemulen. Snuffkin added gaiety to the expedition. He played songs on his mouth organ that they had never heard before, songs from all corners of the earth. He did card tricks and showed them how to make fig pancakes, and he told them many of his strange and wonderful adventures. The river, too, seemed more lively. It was narrower and flowed swift and strong, eddying round rocks and boulders between high banks. Every day the blue and purple mountains came nearer, and they were so high that sometimes their tops disappeared in the heavy rolling clouds. One morning Snuffkin sat with his legs dangling in the water, carving a whistle for himself. "I remember," he began, putting his head on one side, and Moomintroll and Sniff immediately pricked up their ears. "I remember the land with the hot springs. The ground was covered with lava, and from under the lava came a continual rumbling. It was the earth turning over in her sleep. There were rocks strewn about higgledy-piggledy, and everything looked strange and unreal in the hot, steamy atmosphere. I arrived there in the evening. It didn't take long to cook supper. I only had to fill a saucepan from a hot spring. Everything was bubbling and steaming, and I didn't see a single living thing, not so much as a blade of grass." "Didn't you burn your feet?" asked Sniff. "I walked on stilts," Snuffkin answered. "They were wonderful for climbing, and I don't know what I should have done without them when the earth that had been asleep suddenly woke up. There was a great rumbling and roaring, and a crater opened right in front of me and belched out red flames and great clouds of ashes." "A volcano!" gasped Moomintroll and held his breath. "Yes," said Snuffkin, "it was awful, but beautiful too. And then I saw the fire spirits. Lots of them, swarming up and out of the earth and flying about like sparks. Of course, I had to go a roundabout way to get past the volcano. It was hot too, so I went as fast as my stilts would carry me. Halfway down the mountain I came across a little stream and lay down to drink. The water wasn't boiling in that stream, you see. And then one of the little fire spirits floated down and fell into the water. He was nearly extinguished, but just had enough strength to cry out to me to save him." "And did you?" asked Sniff. "Oh, yes. I had nothing against the creature," said Snuffkin, "but I burned myself on him, you know. Well, there he was on dry land again, and presently he began to flare up to his normal state. He was very grateful, of course, and gave me a present before he flew away." "What was it?" asked Sniff in great excitement. "A bottle of underground sun oil," answered Snuffkin. "It's what the fire spirits rub onto themselves when they go right down into the burning heart of the earth." "And you can go through fire when you've got this oil on?" asked Sniff, his eyes popping out with amazement. "Of course you can," Snuffkin answered. "But why didn't you say so before?" cried Moomintroll. "Now we can all be saved. When the comet comes we just—" "But I've hardly any left," said Snuffkin sadly. "I used most of it up on a couple of trips into the desert, and then saving things from a house on fire. I didn't know. There's only a little drop left in the bottle." "Perhaps there's enough for a little animal of, say, my size?" said Sniff. Snuffkin looked at him. "Perhaps," he said, "but hardly for your tail as well. That will have to go." "Oh, help!" exclaimed Sniff. "Then I'd rather be shriveled right up." But Snuffkin wasn't listening. He sat with wrinkled brow looking at the river. "Listen," he said. "Have you noticed anything different?" "The river has a new sound," said Sniff. It was true. There was a dreadful roaring, and the water eddied and swirled between the rocky shores. "Take down the sail," ordered Snuffkin, going forward to keep a lookout. The river was tearing along faster than ever, like a person who has been out on a long journey and suddenly notices that he is late getting home for supper. The banks closed in, squeezing the foaming water into a narrow trough, and the rocks towered over them higher and steeper than ever.
"Wouldn't it be better to land?"
screamed Sniff above the noise of the water.
"It's too late now,"
Moomin Troll screamed back.
"We must just go on till it gets calmer."
But it didn't get calmer. They rushed wildly through the lonely mountains, whose wet black walls closed in on either side, and the strip of sky above got narrower and narrower. Somewhere in front of them there was a threatening rumble.
"We're going downhill,"
shouted Snuffkin.
"Hold tight."
They all held onto the mast and shut their eyes. There was a crash, a roar, and a shower of spray. Then all was quiet. They had cleared the waterfall.
"Whoa! Strike me pink!"
exclaimed Moomin Troll. It was quite dark all round them, except for patches of white-green foam, and when their eyes got used to the darkness, they saw that the mountain walls had closed over them completely. They were in a tunnel. The tunnel stretched away in front of them, getting smaller and smaller. It was like a nightmare, and though the water was calmer now, it was terribly dark.
"This wasn't the idea exactly," said Moomin Troll. "We seem to be going right down into the earth, instead of up to the top of the mountains."
They all realized the truth of this and sat for a time in gloomy silence. Then Snuffkin said, "You could write a poem about this. What about floating on this eerie water, far away from bricks and mortar?"
"Saw a mermaid, didn't caught her,"
suggested Sniff, blowing his nose. "That's not true, not grammar, and it doesn't even rhyme properly," said Snuffkin, and the subject dropped. The tunnel curved once or twice, getting even narrower and darker, and now and then the raft bumped against the walls. They picked up their rucksacks and waited. Once more there was a bump, and this time the mast was knocked down.
"Snuffkin,"
said Moomin Troll in a very small voice,
"you know what that means, don't you?"
The vault above them had become lower, or else the water had risen. Very soon it would completely fill the tunnel. "Throw the mast overboard!" shouted Snuffkin, grabbing his precious flag. "It's no use now." There was another long, silent wait. It had begun to be a little lighter, and they could distinguish each other's white faces. Suddenly, Sniff shouted,
"Oh, my ears touched the roof!"
and threw himself flat with a frantic squeak.
"What will Mamma say," said Moomin Troll, "if we never come home again?"
Just then the raft stopped with a thud, and they all fell together in a heap.
"We've run aground!"
screamed Sniff. Snuffkin leaned over the edge and looked. "The mast is holding us," he said. "It's lying across the tunnel."
"Oh, look what we've escaped,"
said Moomin Troll in a shaky voice. Just in front of them the river disappeared with a gurgle down a black hole straight into the earth.
"I've just about had enough of voyages of discovery,"
said Sniff plaintively.
"I want to go home. I suppose we'll have to sit here all our lives playing poker."
"You silly little animal," said Snuffkin, "grumbling just when we're going to be saved by nothing less than a miracle. Look up there." Sniff looked and saw, through a crack in the rock above them, a small patch of cloudy sky.
"Well, I'm not a bird," he said gloomily. "And what's more, I get dizzy fits. That's because I had an inflammation of the ears when I was very young. So how could I ever get up there?"
But Snuffkin took out his mouth organ and played his gayest adventure song. Not just the right-sized adventure, but a terrific one. About rescues and surprises and sunshine. Moomin Troll started to whistle the refrain. He couldn't sing, but he could whistle beautifully. And in the end, Sniff had to join in too with his falsetto squeak. It was a bit out of tune, but fairly cheerful. Their song echoed in the tunnel and up through the crack in the roof until it woke a Hemulen, who was asleep up above, with his butterfly net beside him.
"Whatever's that?"
gasped the Hemulen with a start. He looked into his jar, where all the small creatures he had caught were imprisoned, but the insects hadn't made the noise. It came straight out of the ground.
"Remarkable,"
said the Hemulen, and lay down flat to listen.
"There must be some rare caterpillar that makes that noise. I must find it."
And he began creeping around, snuffing and sniffing with his large nose, until he reached the hole in the ground where the noise was loudest of all. He stuck his nose in as far as possible, but couldn't see anything in the dark. However, the party down below saw his shadow across the light, and their song changed to a wild yell.
"Those caterpillars must have gone off their heads,"
the Hemulen said to himself, pushing his net down the hole. Of course, Moomin Troll and the others didn't waste much time in jumping into it with their belongings, and when the Hemulen hauled up his heavy load and shook it out, he was amazed to see 3 such odd creatures blinking in the daylight.
"Most extraordinary,"
he remarked.
"Thank you very much,"
said Moomin Troll, who pulled himself together first.
"You saved us in the nick of time." "Have I saved you?"
asked the Hemulen in surprise.
"I didn't mean to. I was looking for the caterpillars that were making such a noise down there."
Hemulens are generally a bit slow in grasping an idea, but they are very pleasant if you don't annoy them.
"Are we in the Lonely Mountains now?"
asked Sniff.
"I've no idea," said the Hemulen, "but there are plenty of interesting moths."
"I think it must be the Lonely Mountains," said Snuffkin, gazing at the massive piles of rock, endless, desolate, and silent, which towered on every side. The air was chilly.
"And where is the observatory?"
asked Sniff. "We're going to look for it," said Moomin Troll. "It's on the highest peak, I believe, but first I should like to have some coffee." "The kettle's still on the raft," said Snuffkin. Moomin Troll loved coffee, and he rushed at once to the edge of the hole and looked down.
"Oh, dearie me," he lamented. "The raft has floated off, and I suppose it's gone down that awful hole by now."
"Well, never mind. We're not on it," said Snuffkin gaily. "What's a kettle here or there when you're out looking for a comet?"
"Are they very rare?"
asked the Hemulen, who thought they were still talking about moths. "Well, yes, I should think you could call them rare," answered Snuffkin. "They appear about once in 100 years."
"No!" exclaimed the Hemulen. "Then I must catch one. What does it look like?"
"Red, probably, with a long tail," answered Snuffkin. The Hemulen took out a notebook and wrote this down.
"It must be the Snuffsigalonica family," he said seriously. "One more question, my learned friends. What does this remarkable insect live on?"
"On Hemulens," said Sniff, giggling. The Hemulen went red in the face.
"Little animal," he said sternly, "that is not funny. I shall now leave, with grave doubts of your scientific knowledge."
And he put his jars in his pocket, picked up his butterfly net, and lumbered off. Sniff doubled up with laughter when the Hemulen was out of earshot.
"How funny!" he exploded. "The old chap thought we were talking about a beetle or something." It's wrong to be disrespectful to elderly gentlemen,"
said Moomin Troll severely, not, however, managing to keep a very straight face himself. But it was getting late, so they picked out the highest mountain and set off towards it.